Buy the horse, and I'll give you the 2 girls for free." The man said it casually, as if he were throwing in an extra saddle. Elias Boone stood in the middle of the Red Creek livery yard, staring at the trader like he had just heard something break inside the world. He had come into town for one reason: a horse, nothing more. But now 2 human lives had just been placed on the bargain table like spare equipment. They stood behind the mare in the shade of the stable roof. 2 identical girls. Same dark hair, same faded rose dresses, same quiet posture, hands folded in front of them like statues waiting for judgment. Japanese. Even the dust of Dakota could not hide that. They did not beg. They did not speak. They simply stood there, perfectly still, like they had learned long ago that survival sometimes meant becoming invisible. The trader chuckled when Elias didn't answer. "My nieces," he said. Then he spat into the dirt. "Parents dead. Been dragging them across half the territory. Don't need the burden anymore." Elias slowly looked from the mare to the girls, then back to the man. The heat of the afternoon pressed down on the yard like a lid on a coffin. "Take them," the trader repeated. "No extra charge." Behind him, one of the stable boys stopped sweeping. Even the horses seemed to go quiet. Elias had seen cruelty before. The frontier was built on it. But this was different. This was the moment where a man decided whether he would look away or carry something heavier than he planned. One of the girls finally lifted her eyes, just for a second. There was no plea there, no tears, only exhaustion, and a small, stubborn spark that refused to die. Elias knew that look. Men carried it out of war. Animals carried it after too many beatings. He could walk away, take the horse, ride home, pretend none of this had anything to do with him. Most men would. But something old and buried inside Elias Boone shifted. Something that remembered the difference between being alone and being a coward. He dropped the coins into the trader's hand. "I'll take the horse." The man grinned. Then Elias added quietly, "And the girls." For the first time, both sisters raised their eyes. That was the moment Elias Boone unknowingly changed 3 lives and the future of an entire valley. The road out of Red Creek stretched into open country, a pale ribbon of dust cutting through miles of dry Dakota grass. Elias Boone walked in front, the mare's rope loose in his hand. Behind him, the 2 sisters followed, always the same distance, always silent. Their footsteps were light against the dry earth, almost careful, as if they feared the ground itself might object to their presence. Elias did not look back often, not because he had forgotten them, because he knew what fear looked like, and staring at frightened people rarely made them less afraid. The sun slid slowly west, burning the hills in shades of copper and gold. Wind moved through the brittle grass like the whisper of paper. They walked for nearly 2 hours. No one spoke. But once, when the trail narrowed between two low ridges, Elias slowed his pace slightly, just enough so they wouldn't have to rush. He noticed the smaller one glance at the horizon, then at the empty road behind them, checking, measuring distance. They had learned to watch escape routes. That told him everything he needed to know about the life they had lived before today. By the time the ranch came into view, the sky had softened into evening. The house sat alone on a gentle rise of land, a square timber structure weathered silver by wind and sun. A barn leaned nearby. A small fenced pasture stretched toward a narrow creek that glimmered faintly in the fading light. It was not much, but it was clean, ordered, quiet. Elias stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. The sisters halted behind him instantly, as if waiting for permission to breathe. He tied the mare to the rail, then pushed the door open. The inside of the house smelled faintly of cedar smoke and dust. Elias stepped aside. "This room," he said. His voice sounded rough, unused. He gestured toward the small bedroom beside the main room, a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out toward the hills. The sisters did not move. Elias realized something then. For them, every doorway probably felt like a trap. So he did the only thing he could think of. He walked past them, through the house, and out the back door. The evening air outside felt cooler. Crickets had begun their quiet music in the grass. Elias sat down in the old chair on the porch, letting the wood creak beneath his weight. He faced the open fields instead of the doorway, giving them space, giving them choice. Several minutes passed. Then he heard it. The faint sound of footsteps crossing the floorboards. Not running, not rushing, careful. The door closed softly behind them. Elias did not turn around, but something in the quiet had changed. The house no longer sounded empty. Later, when the sun had fully dropped below the hills, Elias went back inside. The bedroom door was closed. A thin line of lamplight glowed beneath it. On the kitchen table he placed a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a tin cup filled with water from the well. He knocked once on the door, lightly. "Food," he said. Then he walked away again. That night the ranch felt different. Not louder, still quiet, but it was the quiet of 3 breathing souls under one roof instead of one man and his memories. Elias lay awake longer than usual, listening. Once he heard the soft murmur of 2 voices speaking quickly in a language he did not understand, Japanese. The sound faded quickly, like birds settling for the night. Outside, the wind shifted, moving slowly across the dry fields. Elias stared up at the dark ceiling, thinking about something he had tried not to notice all summer. The creek beside his ranch, once wide enough to water the whole pasture, had shrunk to a thin, restless ribbon. The land was drying, slowly, relentlessly. And for the first time in years, Elias Boone was no longer facing that problem alone. The first morning came quietly. Elias woke before sunrise, the way he always did. For years the habit had been simple: wake, work, eat alone, sleep. But this morning something was different. There were 2 extra breaths inside the house, 2 unfamiliar silences. He dressed quickly and stepped outside before the sun cleared the hills. The pasture was pale with early light, the air cool for the first time in days. Elias worked through his chores the way he always had: feed the mare, check the fence line, pull water from the well. But when he came back to the house an hour later, he stopped on the porch. The door was open, just slightly. Inside, he could hear movement, soft, careful. He stepped in slowly. The kitchen smelled different, cleaner. The bread he had left the night before was gone. The tin cup had been washed, set neatly beside the basin. And standing near the window, watching the rising sun over the fields, were the 2 sisters. They turned at the sound of his boots. Both of them stiffened instantly. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then the taller one, the one named Aiko, gave a small, careful bow of her head. Not submission, respect. Elias nodded once in return. It felt strangely formal. Anne, quieter, stood slightly behind her sister. Her eyes moved around the room quickly. Not fearful now, studying. Elias poured water from the kettle. "Coffee," he said simply. The word clearly meant nothing to them, but when he handed them the cups, they accepted carefully with both hands. Another habit from another world. They drank slowly. The bitter taste made Anne's nose wrinkle slightly. Aiko hid a small smile behind the rim of the cup. It was the first hint of warmth Elias had seen on either face. Later that morning, he went out to repair a section of fence near the creek. The ground there had begun to crack from the dry heat. The creek itself had shrunk. Once it had been wide enough to reflect the sky. Now it was barely more than a narrow thread of water crawling through mud. Elias stood there for a moment, staring at it. He had been ignoring the problem all summer, but drought was not something a rancher could ignore forever. The sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. The sisters stood a few yards away, watching. They had changed clothes. Instead of the thin pink dresses, they now wore loose shirts Elias had left folded near their door. The sleeves were far too long. The fabric hung around their smaller frames, but it protected their skin from the sun. Aiko stepped forward slightly. Her gaze moved from the cracked earth to the creek, then toward the hills beyond the ranch. She crouched near the edge of the dry bank, ran her fingers slowly through the dirt. Anne followed, kneeling beside her. They spoke quietly to each other in Japanese. Quick, soft words. Observations. Elias watched them for a moment, curious. Then Aiko stood and walked toward him. Not close, but closer than before. She pointed toward the hills, then toward the creek, then made a slow, winding motion in the air with her hand. Elias frowned slightly. It took him a moment, then another. "Water?" he asked. Aiko nodded. She stepped closer again, this time near enough that Elias could see small beads of sweat along her hairline. The morning sun lit faint gold along the edges of her dark hair. She pointed again toward the hills, then traced a longer, gentler path downward with her finger. A channel. Elias felt a slow realization forming. You think the runoff from the basin could reach here. Aiko didn't understand the words, but she understood his tone. She nodded again, more confidently. Anne smiled slightly beside her. Elias looked back toward the hills. He had lived on this land for 8 years. Yet somehow, these two strangers had seen something he hadn't. He laughed softly under his breath, not mocking, surprised. "Maybe you're smarter than this old rancher," he muttered. Neither sister understood the sentence, but something in his voice made Aiko's lips curve faintly. For a brief moment, the tension between them shifted. Not fear, not distance, something quieter, something like the first fragile thread of trust. And though none of them said it aloud, that morning beside a dying creek, a partnership had quietly begun. Work began the next morning. Not with a grand plan, not with speeches, just 3 people standing in dry grass beneath a hard Dakota sky, staring up toward the hills. Elias handed them tools, a shovel, a pickaxe, a coil of measuring twine. He pointed toward the ridge, then toward the cracked earth beside the creek. "Water," he said. The sisters exchanged a quick glance. Then Aiko nodded once. They started walking. The climb into the hills was slow. The sun rose higher, turning the rocks hot beneath their boots. Grass scratched against their legs. Dust clung to their skin. But neither sister complained, not once. Anne carried the wooden stakes. Aiko held the twine, stretching it carefully between them while Elias measured the slope of the land. Sometimes they spoke quietly to each other, short sentences, sharp observations. Even without understanding their language, Elias could hear something inside their voices. Focus, precision. They were not guessing, they were calculating. By midday they had marked the path, a long, curving line descending from the north basin, bending naturally along the ridge before reaching the dry creek. Elias stared down the path they had traced. It was longer than the route he had imagined, but the slope was smoother, more gradual, which meant something important. The water would keep moving. "Hell," Elias muttered quietly. "That just might work." Aiko looked up at him. Though she didn't understand the words, she understood the tone. Her expression softened, just slightly. That afternoon the digging began. Pickaxes struck the earth. Metal against stone echoed across the hillside. Elias did the heavy work, breaking through the packed soil, but the sisters moved in behind him, clearing debris, shaping the channel walls with smaller tools. They worked with a strange rhythm, almost like dancers learning each other's timing. Elias would lift a rock, Anne would slide in, packing the loose dirt tight against the trench wall. Aiko would check the slope with the twine, adjusting angles with careful movements of her hands. Hours passed. Sweat soaked through their shirts. Dust streaked their arms and faces. At one point, Elias paused, leaning on the shovel. His chest rose slowly with heavy breath. Across the trench, Aiko stood brushing dirt from her hands. A loose strand of hair clung to her cheek. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them felt different now. Not uncertain, not fragile. Something warmer, something curious. Aiko noticed his eyes on her. Her own gaze dropped immediately, but not before a faint color touched her cheeks. Anne saw it. Her quiet smile flickered for half a second. Then the moment was gone. The work continued. 2 days later, the first visitor arrived. Sheriff Brody rode up the dirt lane just before sunset. His horse snorted at the unfamiliar smell of fresh-turned soil. The sheriff dismounted slowly, brushing dust from his coat. His eyes moved from Elias to the sisters, then back again. "So it's true," he said. "Town's been talking." Elias leaned the shovel against the fence. "What are they saying now?" Brody tilted his head slightly toward the sisters. "They say you bought yourself 2 foreign girls." Behind Elias, the sisters stiffened. Even without understanding the exact words, they understood the tone. Brody continued, "A man living alone out here with them," he shrugged. "Folks wonder what kind of arrangement that is." The air around the ranch grew very still. Elias stepped forward slightly, not aggressively, but enough that he stood between the sheriff and the sisters. "They work here," he said. "Same as me." Brody raised an eyebrow. "They speak English now?" "They understand enough." Elias's voice had grown colder. "And they're under my protection." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then spat into the dirt. Just saying what folks are thinking." He swung back into the saddle. "Town's watching, Elias." Then he rode away down the lane. For a while, no one spoke. Anne finally stepped closer to her sister, whispering something softly in Japanese. Aiko looked toward Elias. Her expression held something new now. Not just gratitude, respect. Because on the frontier, protection meant something very different than kindness. It meant a man had chosen a side, and Elias Boone had just chosen theirs. The sky changed 3 weeks later. All afternoon the air had felt strange, heavy, thick, like the land itself was holding its breath. Dark clouds rolled slowly across the Dakota hills. Not the thin, drifting kind the territory was used to. These were different, deep, bruised, full. Elias stood beside the half-finished reservoir, staring toward the North Basin. Aiko and Anne stood beside him, their clothes streaked with dust, hands raw from weeks of digging. The trench behind them stretched down the hillside, a winding scar of fresh earth lined carefully with stone. Their work. If the water came, they would know if the plan worked. Thunder rolled across the sky, low and distant. Anne looked upward first. Then the first drop of rain struck the dry dirt. Another followed. Then another. Within minutes the sky opened. Rain poured over the hills, soaking the ground, turning dust into dark, rich mud. Elias watched the basin above them, waiting. For a long moment nothing happened. Then Aiko suddenly pointed. A thin brown ribbon of water spilled over the ridge. It gathered speed, rushing down the slope, straight toward the mouth of the channel they had carved. Anne grabbed Elias's arm without thinking, her fingers tight with excitement. The water reached the trench. For one terrifying second, Elias thought it might spill over the sides. But it didn't. It followed the curve, exactly as Aiko had drawn it. The stream rushed down the stone-lined channel, bending along the ridge, gathering strength with every yard. Then it poured into the reservoir. The sound echoed across the valley like distant thunder. Water. Real water. Elias laughed out loud, a rough, unfamiliar sound. Aiko covered her mouth, laughing too. Anne simply stood there smiling, rain streaming down her face. For the first time since they had arrived on the ranch, all three of them looked completely alive. Weeks passed. The reservoir filled slowly. The channel held. The creek returned. Green began spreading across the fields around the ranch. Corn pushed up through the soil. Vegetables flourished beside the house. But beyond Elias Boone's land, the drought only worsened. The surrounding ranches turned brown. Cattle grew thin. Wells dried. And eventually riders began appearing on the road. At first one, then two, then more. Men who had once ignored Elias Boone now stood at the edge of his fields, staring at the impossible green valley before them. Sheriff Brody was among them. He removed his hat when he reached the porch, a rare sign of humility. "My well's dry," he said quietly. Elias looked out across the gathered ranchers. Fear lived in their eyes now, not suspicion. Behind him, Aiko and Anne stood in the doorway, silent, watching. Elias turned back toward the hills, toward the channel, toward the reservoir they had built together. They had enough water to survive the season, maybe longer. They could keep it, protect it. But Aiko stepped forward. She pointed toward the neighboring ranches, then toward the reservoir, then made a wide motion with both hands. More channels, more water. Anne nodded. Elias understood. If three people could build one channel, an entire valley could build a network. That winter the work began. Ranchers dug together for the first time in Red Creek's history. New trenches spread across the valley. Reservoirs formed on neighboring land. Aiko designed the routes. Anne oversaw the stonework. Elias led the crews. Years passed. Where dust had once ruled, green fields now stretched across the valley. The irrigation network became known simply as the Red Creek System. And at the center of it all stood the small ranch where it had begun. One evening, many years later, an old Elias Boone sat on his porch watching the sun set across the water channels. Aiko sat beside him, Anne on the other side. Their hands rested quietly together, as natural as the land around them. A young journalist visiting from the East had asked them earlier that day how such a miracle had been built. Elias had only smiled. "It wasn't a miracle," he said. "We were just three people who refused to let the land, or each other, die." The last light faded across the valley. Water glimmered in the channels like ribbons of gold. And the ranch that had once been the loneliest place in Dakota had become the heart of a community.